I'm so glad you're here. My name is Frankie Miller, and at 60 years old, I thought I had seen it all. I've always believed that a mother's job is to protect her family, no matter the cost. But what happens when the ones you're trying to protect are the ones setting the trap? Just last week, my daughter-in-law, Zoe, sat right here in my living room, tears streaming down her beautiful face, begging me for $10,000 to save her dying mother. My heart broke for her. I wrote her the check without a second thought. But there was one thing she didn't know. That check I gave her was a trap, and it was about to bounce spectacularly, right in the middle of a Neiman Marcus. They thought I was just a gullible old woman. They were about to find out how wrong they were. If you're watching this, please like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know just how far my story of revenge has traveled. The annoyance prickled at me as I rummaged through my purse for the third time. Nothing. My checkbook was gone. It was a minor inconvenience, one of the many small logistical hurdles a 60-year-old widow learns to navigate on her own. But the gut feeling of a woman who has seen enough of life to recognize the scent of trouble told me this was no simple act of forgetfulness. I took a deep breath. The familiar smell of lemon wood polish in my neat suburban kitchen, doing little to quell the unease coiling in my stomach. My late husband, Robert, had been gone for 5 years, but his wisdom remained my steadfast companion. He was a methodical man, an engineer who believed in prevention over cure. "Frankie," he'd often say, his voice a low rumble as he meticulously organized our tax documents, "always be one step ahead. Never wait for trouble to come knocking." His words echoed in my mind now, as clear as the Tuesday morning light streaming through my window. Instead of panicking, I acted. I calmly brewed a cup of chamomile tea, the ritualistic process, a small anchor in a suddenly choppy sea. With my cordless phone in hand, I sat in my worn armchair and dialed the bank. My objective was clear: lock it all down. I didn't know where the checkbook was. Perhaps it had slipped out at the grocery store yesterday, or worse, been deliberately lifted. In this day and age, a woman living alone couldn't be too careful. The conversation with the young bank teller was swift and professional. Her voice was a placid monotone, but to me, each of her words was a brick being laid in the fortress wall around the financial independence I had worked my entire life to build. "Yes," I said into the receiver, my tone firmer than I expected. "I want to stop payment on all current checks, effective immediately, and place a temporary freeze on the account until I can come in to get new documents." A few minutes later, a confirmation email pinged on my tablet. "Transaction block confirmed." A wave of relief washed over me, the feeling of a bullet dodged. I had handled it. I briefly considered calling my son, Mark, and his wife, Zoe, just to let them know, but I quickly dismissed the thought. They had their own lives, their own stresses, and I had no desire to bother them with what was likely just my own absent-mindedness. I took a sip of my tea, savoring the warmth. The quiet of the house settled around me once more, a comforting blanket. I had just set the mug down on its coaster when the doorbell chimed, a sharp, jarring sound in the morning calm. My heart jumped. Moving to the door, I peered through the peephole and saw Zoe standing on my porch. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was uncharacteristically messy, and her wide blue eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. My heart clenched. She never visited unannounced. The moment I opened the door, Zoe collapsed into my arms, her body trembling like a leaf in a storm. The scent of her expensive perfume, a heady, almost suffocating tuberose I knew cost as much as a month's worth of my utility bills, seemed jarringly out of place against the raw tragedy she was performing. It was a scent for celebrations, for cocktail parties, not for the grim threshold of a family crisis. I held her, feeling the rhythmic, theatrical sobs against my shoulder as I guided her inside, my hand on her back, feeling the fine, expensive silk of her blouse. "Zoe, what is it? What's wrong, honey?" I asked, my voice laced with a concern that was 90% genuine. In the 3 years since she'd married Mark, I'd grown accustomed to Zoe's dramatic flair. I remembered the time she'd called me in hysterics over a lost diamond earring, a family heirloom, only to find it an hour later in the pocket of her own coat. She was a woman who felt her emotions in operatic swells, a constant whirlwind of highs and lows. I had learned to be the calm harbor in her frequent tempests, though a small part of me had always wondered how much of it was real. She didn't answer right away, just shook her head against my shoulder, her sobs intensifying into a gut-wrenching wail that felt slightly too loud for my quiet home. I guided her into the living room, the quiet order of my life, the polished oak furniture, the neatly stacked magazines on the coffee table, the faded photograph of Robert and a young Mark on the mantelpiece, a stark contrast to the chaos she had brought with her. "Sit down, dear. Let me get you a glass of water." Zoe perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands twisting the delicate fabric of her dress, her gaze fixed on the intricate pattern of the Persian rug. It was a gesture I recognized. It was the prelude to a significant request, a performance about to begin. Just then, my phone rang on the hall table, its cheerful ringtone a jarring interruption. I saw Mark's name on the screen. I knew, with a sudden, sinking certainty that this was a coordinated effort, a pincer movement of emotional manipulation. "Mom!" My son's voice came through the line, tight with a practiced anxiety. "Is Zoe with you? Mom, something's happened. She's distraught. I hope you can help her. She only trusts you. You're the only one she'll really listen to." His words were a precision strike, targeting my maternal guilt and my desire to be needed. He was reinforcing the walls of the trap, making me the designated savior. When I returned with the water, Zoe had composed herself just enough to begin her tale, her voice a fragile whisper that forced me to lean in closer. "Mom," she started, the word catching in her throat as she took the glass with a trembling hand. It's my mother." She paused for dramatic effect, taking a shaky breath. An actress preparing for her monologue. "She's sick. Very sick." I sat down beside her, placing a comforting hand on her arm, playing my part in this unfolding drama. "What kind of sick, dear?" Zoe finally looked up, her blue eyes brimming with perfectly formed, glistening tears that did not spill. "It's cancer, Mom. The doctors found it late. Stage 4. They said there's a new experimental treatment, a special clinic in Switzerland, but the insurance won't cover any of it. It's considered elective." Every word was delivered with careful, heartbreaking precision. A sick mother, a life-saving but expensive treatment in a foreign country, a desperate, loving daughter. It was the perfect, unimpeachable narrative. She spoke of costs in Swiss francs, of bureaucratic red tape with international insurance, of her family's helplessness, how they had already mortgaged her parents' home to cover the initial costs. It all sounded so plausible if you didn't listen too closely, if you didn't notice the lack of specific names for the clinic or the treatment protocol. It was all shrouded in a vague fog of emotion. "We've tried everything," she said, her voice cracking as she shredded a tissue in her hands. "We've pooled all our money, but we're still short." She fell silent, letting the unspoken request hang heavy in the air between us, a tangible weight. I knew what was coming. "We need," she sobbed, the words catching in her throat, leaving me to fill in the blank. Then, as if on cue, she delivered the final devastating blow, her voice dropping to a near whisper of despair. "They need $10,000 by the end of this week, or my mom won't make it." I looked at my daughter-in-law, her beautiful face streaked with tears, her body slumped in defeat, and the heart of a mother ached within me. Her pain, whether real or feigned, was palpable, a powerful performance designed to evoke a specific response. And it almost worked. But a small, cold voice deep in my mind, a voice that sounded remarkably like Robert's, was asking, "Why does this story sound so perfect? Mark called again, his voice even more urgent this time, a frantic edge to his words that felt both genuine and rehearsed. "Mom, did Zoe explain everything? We're really in a bind here." I felt the walls closing in, the space in my own living room suddenly feeling tight and constricting. I was being backed into a corner, pinned against the wall by my own love for him. This wasn't the first time my help had been solicited with such intensity. I remembered the $5,000 for the down payment on their condo, a loan that was never spoken of again. I remembered the $3,000 for the used car when Mark's broke down, a sum he promised to repay in installments that never materialized. They had grown accustomed to my financial safety net, and now they were pulling on it with all their might, expecting it to hold without question. "I'm talking with her now, Mark," I replied, trying to push back, to cling to the logic that was rapidly slipping away. I turned to Zoe, who was watching me with wide, pleading eyes, the picture of filial desperation. "What about her insurance, Zoe?" I asked again, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "What are the hospital's payment options? Surely they have a plan for situations like this, even for international patients." Zoe shook her head, a practiced gesture of despair, her blonde hair catching the afternoon light. "It's a private clinic, Mom, a special treatment protocol. It's not part of the standard system. They require the full amount up front in cash or certified funds. They won't make exceptions, not when there's a waiting list of other patients." Her answers were too smooth, too ready, leaving no room for further questions. She had anticipated my skepticism and built a narrative wall around it, a fortress of plausible excuses. And then Mark delivered the final, calculated blow over the phone, his voice shifting from worried to reproachful. "Mom," he said, and I could feel the sting of his disappointment even through the line. "This is a person's life. Are you really hesitating because of money? I thought you always said family was everything." The words were a dagger to the heart. He was using my own values, the very principles I had raised him with, as a weapon against me. In that moment, I felt utterly alone, a solitary holdout against a united front of familial obligation and moral blackmail. The weight of their combined expectation was crushing, and the guilt he so expertly wielded settled over me like a shroud. I looked at Zoe, at her tear-streaked face, at the desperation that seemed so real, so utterly convincing. My resolve crumbled. I let out a long, slow sigh of defeat, the air leaving my lungs in a rush of resignation. "All right," I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "I'll help. I'll write you a check." As I uttered the promise, I saw it. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of pure triumph flashed in Zoe's eyes, a slight, almost imperceptible upward curl of her lips, before it was immediately extinguished and replaced by a look of overwhelming, tearful gratitude. But I had seen it. It was the glint of a predator who has successfully cornered its prey. "Let me get my checkbook," I said, my voice hollow. I rose from the sofa and walked toward my small study, my feet feeling heavy, as if I were walking to my own execution. I felt sick with a mixture of resignation and a deep, unsettling doubt that refused to be silenced. And then, as my hand reached for the cool brass handle of my study door, it hit me like a splash of icy water, a jolt of pure, clarifying adrenaline. The checkbook. I didn't have it. I had reported it missing. I had frozen the account. And in that moment, a cold, clear thought cut through the emotional fog. Perhaps this wasn't a complication. Perhaps this was a gift. The house was too quiet that night. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was accusatory, a mocking void that amplified my churning doubts. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to count down the seconds until a truth I wasn't ready for would detonate. I sat in my small, lamplit study, the scent of old books and dried lavender, a familiar comfort that now felt like a lie. I could almost hear Robert's voice, a low and steady anchor in my memory, saying, Frankie, when a story is too tragic and too perfect, that's when you need to check the small details. He had been an engineer, a man of logic and facts, and his cautious nature had been the bedrock of our 40-year marriage. Tonight, I needed his wisdom more than ever. My first act was to buy myself time. I picked up the phone, my fingers, usually steady from decades of gardening, feeling clumsy as I dialed Zoe's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice a careful blend of hope and sorrow. "Mom, did you find it?" I took a deep breath and let the lie slip out, as smooth as honey. "Zoe, honey, it's me. I've turned the house upside down, but I can't find my new checkbook. I must have left it at the bank when I was there last week. I'm so sorry, dear, but I'll have to go first thing in the morning to sort it out." I heard a faint sigh on the other end, a flicker of impatience quickly masked by practiced understanding. "Oh, okay, Mom. Of course. Just as soon as you can, please." After we hung up, I sat in the stillness, the lie settling uncomfortably in my stomach. But it was a necessary lie. It was a shield. Next, I turned to my computer, its glow pushing back the shadows in the room. I began to search. Experimental oncology treatments, non-insured cancer protocols, private funding for urgent surgery. My fingers flew across the keyboard. The web was a vast ocean of information, yet it yielded no island that matched the one Zoe had described. The more I searched, the more her story felt like a ghost, insubstantial, without a trace in the real world. My unease grew into a cold knot of dread. Finally, I navigated to the familiar blue and white interface of social media. Zoe's own page was a carefully curated gallery of happiness, smiling photos with Mark, inspirational quotes, pictures of beautifully arranged dinners. There was nothing to suggest a family in the throes of a medical crisis. It was all too perfect. Then I remembered her husband's advice, the small details. I navigated away from her page to that of one of her closest friends, a bubbly young woman named Jessica, whose life seemed to be an open book online. I scrolled through a week's worth of posts, brunches, shopping trips, gym selfies, and there it was, a photograph posted just 2 days ago on Monday, October 13th. The image showed Zoe radiant and laughing, surrounded by Jessica and 2 other friends. They were seated at an upscale rooftop bar I recognized from a magazine, the city skyline twinkling behind them. In Zoe's hand was a vibrant pink cocktail, and in front of them, a platter of expensive-looking appetizers. The caption beneath the photo was a celebratory shout, celebrating Zoe's big deal, the sky's the limit, #bossbabe, #success. A big deal? I stared at the screen, my mind racing to connect the 2 irreconcilable images, the carefree woman in the photo and the devastated daughter from this afternoon. I glanced at the notepad on my desk, where I'd scribbled, $10,000, mother's surgery. The 2 realities could not coexist. One of them had to be a brazen, calculated lie. The phone rang at precisely 9 a.m. on Wednesday, the 15th of October, its shrill sound slicing through the heavy silence of my kitchen. I was staring at the cold dregs of my coffee. The image of Zoe's triumphant smile from that online photograph burned into my mind. I flinched at the noise. It was Arthur, my late husband's best and oldest friend. His voice, usually a cheerful baritone, was laced with an uncharacteristic hesitation. "Frankie, it's Art. Hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." I drew a breath, steadying myself. "Never, Arthur. It's good to hear from you." Arthur had been a rock for me since Robert passed, a steadfast link to a happier time, and his loyalty was beyond question. He made small talk for a moment, asking about my garden and the leaky faucet he'd offered to fix, but I could hear the unease in his voice. "Frankie, listen," he finally said, his tone dropping. "I don't want to meddle in family business, you know that. But I was at the Northgate Mall yesterday and I saw Zoe." I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. "Oh?" I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Yes," he continued. "And she looked wonderful, happy, laughing with a friend, I just thought it was nice to see is all. I waited, knowing there was more. The thing is, he said, the hesitation returning, they were in that fancy handbag store, Michael Kors. Zoe was trying on a couple of bags, beautiful leather things. The price tag on one was nearly $1,000. Every word was a hammer blow, methodically driving the nails into the coffin of my denial. Zoe, whose mother was supposedly on her deathbed, was happily shopping for $1,000 handbags. I thought of the tear-streaked face in my living room, the desperate sobs, the story of a life hanging in the balance. The sheer audacity of the deception was breathtaking. I managed to keep my voice even, a feat of willpower I didn't know I possessed. Thank you for telling me, Arthur. I appreciate it. I was about to hang up to retreat into the cold fury that was beginning to build, but then he added the final damning detail. It was just so strange, Frankie, he said, almost as an afterthought. In this day and age, you know. The strange thing was, she paid with a thick wad of cash. I just found it odd, is all. After I hung up, I stood motionless in the kitchen for a long time, the receiver still cold against my ear. The initial sharp sting of betrayal had subsided, replaced by something much colder, much harder, cash. I stood up and walked on steady feet to my study desk, the same desk where I'd sat last night, drowning in a sea of doubt. But the doubt was gone now. In its place was a terrible crystalline clarity. This wasn't a debt. This was a scam, and I would not be its victim. When the courier delivered the temporary checkbook that Wednesday afternoon, the 16th of October, I held it in my hands and felt a profound shift inside me. I no longer felt the pressure of a demand, but the cool, heavy weight of a weapon. The power wasn't in the money it represented, but in the truth it would soon reveal. Robert's words, a quiet echo from the past, came back to me with startling clarity. The best way to deal with a liar, Frankie, he'd once told me, sorting through blueprints at this very desk, is to give them enough rope to hang themselves. I finally understood the brutal wisdom of his advice. The time for sorrow was over. The time for action had begun. My first move was to pick up the phone and call Zoe. I took a moment to compose myself, summoning a voice filled with the warmth and sympathy she expected. "Zoe, honey, it's me," I said, the feigned concern flowing easily. "The bank just sent over a temporary checkbook. I'm so relieved. Why don't you come by this afternoon and pick it up?" On the other end of the line, I heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by a rush of effusive gratitude. "Oh, Mom, thank you, thank you. I'll be there as soon as I can. You're a lifesaver." The performance was flawless, but I could hear the undercurrent of triumphant greed beneath the veneer of relief. After the call, I sat at my desk and opened the new checkbook. I uncapped my favorite fountain pen, the one Robert had given me for our 30th anniversary. I smoothed the blank check and began to write. The date, October 15th, 2025. The recipient, Zoe Miller. The amount, in clear, steady script, $10,100. I stared at the numbers. This wasn't a gift. It wasn't an act of love. It was a perfectly calibrated instrument of justice. It was a bullet, and I was aiming it straight at the heart of her deception. With the check written, I made my second call. "Arthur, it's Frankie," I said when he answered. "I need a favor, a rather unusual one." I explained my plan in concise, clear terms, leaving out the emotional turmoil. "Can you be at the Neiman Marcus at the Northgate Mall tomorrow around 11 a.m.? She fancies their handbags." I heard him let out a low whistle. "Frankie, are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Art," I replied. "Just observe, and if you see anything unusual, record it, discreetly." There was a pause, and then his voice came back, firm with the loyalty of a lifelong friend. "I'll be there." I placed the signed check into a crisp, cream-colored envelope. Beside it, I took a small note card and wrote, in my most elegant cursive, "To Zoe with all my love, Mom." The irony of the words was a sharp, satisfying pang. I sealed the envelope and placed it squarely in the center of the coffee table in the living room. Just then, the doorbell rang. This time, I was ready. The curtain was about to rise on the final act, and I was the one directing the show. The morning of Thursday, the 17th of October, was crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant, high-sky autumn light that makes everything look sharp and defined. I was out on the porch, the gentle spray from my watering can misting over the last of my resilient autumn chrysanthemums. I moved with a practiced slowness, each small, mundane task a way to keep my hands busy while my mind raced, silently rehearsing the performance I would have to give later today. It was in that quiet moment of contemplation that I saw Joseph, my widowed neighbor of 20 years, walking across his immaculate lawn toward me. His usual friendly wave was absent, replaced by a more serious, hesitant expression that immediately put me on alert. "Frankie," he began as he reached my steps, his voice low, "I have something to tell you." I set down the watering can, giving him my full attention. Joseph wasn't one for idle gossip. In the 2 decades we'd lived side by side, sharing cups of coffee and quiet condolences after we both lost our spouses, I'd come to know him as a discreet and keenly observant man. He respected boundaries, which made his current approach all the more significant. "I don't mean to pry," he said, his gaze shifting from me to the street and back again, a clear sign of his discomfort. "But I saw something last week that's been bothering me. On Tuesday, I saw Zoe driving a new sports car, a bright red convertible, brand new." He paused, letting the information settle, his eyes searching mine for a reaction. At first, I figured it was a rental, for a special occasion. She was laughing on the phone, looked like she didn't have a care in the world. But then, yesterday evening, I saw it parked in your son's garage. That kind of car isn't cheap, Frankie. Not at all. He looked down at his weathered hands for a moment before meeting my eyes again, his own filled with a genuine concern that touched me deeply. "And it's not just the car," he continued, his voice softer now, almost pained. "It's Mark. The boy looks worn to a thread, Frankie. He doesn't have that spark anymore, He comes and goes, always looks worried, and he doesn't stop to chat like he used to. He just gives a quick nod and rushes inside. I get the feeling that girl is running him ragged." His words were a painful confirmation of a fear I hadn't dared to voice even to myself. Mark had changed. He was thinner, the easy, booming laugh I loved so much replaced by a tense, forced smile. He was being drained, and I was only now beginning to understand the source of the leak, the parasite that was feeding on his energy and his bank account. I nodded slowly, a silent thank you for his courage in speaking up. His observations weren't just curious tidbits, they were crucial pieces of a puzzle I was already assembling in my mind. Arthur's phone call, the celebratory photograph online, and now this. The $1,000 handbag wasn't an isolated indulgence. It was part of a systemic deception, a lavish lifestyle built on a foundation of lies and funded by my son's blind devotion and my own carefully saved money. Joseph must have read the turmoil on my face, the storm of anger and sorrow that was warring behind my calm facade. He placed a gentle, calloused hand on my arm. "Listen to me, Frankie," he said, his voice firm with a conviction that steadied my own resolve. "If you need a witness, or just someone to back you up when things get tough, you call me. We old folks have to look out for each other." His offer was a balm to my frayed nerves, a sudden, unexpected warmth in the cold landscape of my fight. I was no longer entirely alone in this. I opened my mouth to thank him, the gratitude welling up in my throat, but the words caught. At that exact moment, the low purr of a powerful engine broke the morning quiet. The sleek, bright red convertible Joseph had just described turned into my driveway, its engine a low growl as it came to a graceful stop. Zoe was here, right on schedule, to collect her prize. Zoe breezed into the house on Thursday, the 17th of October, a whirlwind of feigned distress and expensive fabric. She was playing the part of the anxious daughter beautifully, her face etched with a convincing semblance of worry. "Mom, I came as fast as I could," she said, her voice a breathless performance of anxiety. She looked like a bird of paradise that had strayed into a sparrow's nest, her vibrant silk blouse a splash of jarring color against the muted, comfortable tones of my living room. Her eyes, however, weren't on me. They swept the room in a fraction of a second, bypassing the family photos on the mantel and the carefully arranged furniture, landing with unerring accuracy on the cream-colored envelope I had placed squarely in the center of the coffee table. A radiant smile bloomed on her face, so bright and sudden that it failed to completely conceal the raw, predatory greed that flashed in its depths before being quickly suppressed. She had arrived to claim her prize. I moved toward her, my own actions feeling deliberate and slow, as if I were a character in a play I was both starring in and directing. I picked up the envelope, the paper smooth and cool against my skin. "Here you are, dear," I said, my voice infused with a gentle maternal warmth that felt like a costume I had put on for this final scene. "I truly hope this helps. I hope everything will be all right with your mother. Family has to help each other, after all." The words, steeped in a bitter irony only I could taste, were the necessary lubricant for the gears of the trap I was setting. "Oh, Mom, thank you, thank you!" She threw her arms around me, a hug that was all sharp angles and hurried tension. It was a performer's embrace, hollow and fleeting, lacking the genuine warmth I had once so desperately hoped to receive from her. She pulled back almost immediately, her attention already fixated on the envelope in my hand, which I now passed to her. Her fingers, tipped with glossy, blood-red nails that looked like tiny daggers, tore it open with a haste that was a stark betrayal of her somber story. Her eyes scanned the check, the pupils dilating for just a moment as she registered the clean, authoritative script, spelling out 10,000. That familiar, triumphant glint I had caught a glimpse of before was back, brighter and more arrogant this time, a naked display of her victory. "You have no idea what this means to us," she breathed, clutching the check to her chest as if it were a holy relic. It was the glint of a predator who has just been handed the key to the chicken coop. "I have to get this to the hospital right away," she said, her body already turning toward the door, thrumming with an energy that had nothing to do with filial duty and everything to do with a shopping list. "The doctors are waiting for the deposit." Her excuse was so flimsy, her haste so obvious, that she nearly tripped over the edge of the rug on her way out. She was practically running, her story of a dying mother now just a transparent justification for a quick getaway. I watched her go, not saying another word, the mask of the loving, slightly dotty mother-in-law held firmly in place until the front door clicked shut behind her. The performance was over. Then, and only then, did I allow myself to move. I walked calmly, deliberately, to my living room window, parting the sheer curtains just enough to have a perfect, unobstructed view of my driveway. I watched as Zoe slid into the driver's seat of her gleaming red convertible. The top was down, a defiant gesture against the crisp autumn chill. She didn't start the car. Instead, she pulled out her phone, her thumb dancing across the screen. A moment later, she held it to her ear, and her entire face transformed. The mask of grief and gratitude vanished, replaced by a wide, victorious, unrestrained grin. She laughed, a genuine throaty sound of pure, unadulterated success, throwing her head back against the leather headrest. In that moment, there was no trace of the grief-stricken daughter. There was only a victor, celebrating her spoils. I turned away from the window and picked up my own phone from the side table. My fingers were perfectly steady as I typed a short, simple message to Arthur. She took the bait. "See you at Neiman Marcus tomorrow." I pressed send. The game had begun. "We are getting those Jimmy Choos first," Zoe said into her phone, her voice a triumphant, high-pitched thrill that cut through the low rumble of the convertible's engine. She steered the red sports car out of Frankie's sleepy, tree-lined neighborhood with one hand, the other holding the phone to her ear. The crisp check for $10,000 was tucked safely in her Louis Vuitton wallet on the passenger seat, a tangible symbol of her victory, practically humming with potential. "Jessica, are you hearing this? The gullible old bat actually bought it. All of it. The dying mother, the Swiss clinic. She ate it up with a spoon." The story had been a masterpiece, a symphony of well-timed tears and fabricated desperation. She had almost started to believe it herself. The performance was that convincing. On the other end of the line, she heard Jessica squeal with vicarious delight. "OMG, Zoe, you are literally a genius. 10K, what are we doing?" Lauren, her other best friend, quickly joined the call, her voice crackling with excitement through the car's Bluetooth speaker. "Neiman Marcus. Obviously," Lauren's voice declared. "You have to get that Fendi bag you were looking at last week, the black one with the gold hardware, and I need new sunglasses for the brunch on Sunday." The conversation quickly devolved into a giddy, high-speed planning session. There was no mention of a hospital, no somber discussion of a sick mother fighting for her life. The only emergency on their agenda was deciding between champagne or mimosas at the bistro after their shopping spree. Okay, here's the plan," Zoe said, taking charge, her voice giddy with power. "First, Neiman's, shoes and bags. Then we'll hit Saks for that Alice plus Olivia dress I wanted for the charity gala. After that, lunch at Le Bilboquet. My treat, obviously." She laughed, a sound completely devoid of the sorrow she had so expertly feigned just an hour before. "Wait," Jessica's voice cut in, a hint of caution in her tone. "What about Mark? Does he know about this part?" Zoe let out a short, dismissive laugh. The sound was sharp and cruel, like the flick of a whip. "Mark? Oh, honey, he knows what I need him to know," she said, her voice dripping with a casual condescension. "I told him it was a loan and that we'd pay it back eventually, which, is technically true if you count his inheritance. He believes anything I say. Men are so easy to lead. You just have to make them think they're being the hero, saving the day." Her friends giggled in agreement. To Zoe, Mark wasn't a partner. He was an accessory, a means to an end, and his mother was simply the bank that funded their lifestyle, a resource to be managed and, when necessary, manipulated. She glanced at the dashboard clock. It was almost 10:30 on the morning of Friday, the 18th of October. A sudden, anxious energy pulsed through her. The check felt hot in her purse, a prize that could still be snatched away if she wasn't careful. "All right, listen up, girls," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, the game's excitement turning into a nervous thrill. "We need to move fast on this. The old lady could change her mind or get a sudden pang of seller's remorse at any moment. We need to get this check cashed and the money spent before anything goes wrong." Her friends murmured their assent, their excitement now tinged with the same illicit urgency. The fantasy was only real once the receipts were printed and the shopping bags were in hand. The red convertible sliced through the morning traffic, a vibrant symbol of a life lived on credit and deception. Zoe felt a surge of power, of invincibility. She had done it. She had secured their finances for the next few months, all with a single flawless performance. As she turned into the sprawling parking lot of the Northgate Mall, the iconic cream-colored sign for Neiman Marcus rose before her like a temple to her own cleverness. Across the lot, parked in a discreet spot with a clear, unobstructed view of the entrance, Arthur sat in his Buick, his face grim. He raised his phone, centered the shot, and pressed the small red circle on the screen. He was recording. "Carlos, it's me," I said into the phone, my voice as calm and steady as the old oak tree outside my study window. "It's time. We need to activate Plan B." On the other end of the line, I heard the faint rustle of papers, then the composed professional voice of Carlos Ramirez, the man who had been my late husband's financial advisor and lawyer for over 2 decades. Robert had trusted him implicitly, a trust built on years of shared strategies and mutual respect, and now, so did I. "Frankie," he replied, his tone all business, but with an undercurrent of concern that only a long-standing friend would allow to surface. "I was wondering when you'd call. Tell me everything." I stood in my quiet, sun-drenched study, the room where Robert and I had planned our future, and laid out the sordid details of the past 48 hours with cold, emotionless precision. It felt like a military briefing. I told him about Zoe's theatrical performance, the fabricated story of her dying mother, and the audacious demand for $10,000. I told him about the photograph, the fateful phone call from Arthur, the brand new sports car, and the check that was, at this very moment, a ticking time bomb in my daughter-in-law's designer purse. "She's on her way to Neiman Marcus as we speak," I concluded. "Arthur is already there, waiting. He'll have visual confirmation." Carlos was silent for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of his office in the background. He was processing the sheer audacity of the scheme. "She is more brazen than I thought," he finally said, a note of grudging admiration in his voice. "The documents you requested are prepared and ready to be filed." "Good," I said, moving to the heart of the matter, the part of the plan that went beyond mere exposure. "About the will, Carlos, I want to proceed with the changes immediately. I want an irrevocable trust fund established for Mark." This was the most critical part of my counteroffensive. It wasn't about punishment, it was about protection. It was about building a firewall that Zoe and her insatiable greed could never breach. "The terms are as we discussed," I continued, my voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. "He will receive a monthly stipend for his living expenses, more than enough to live comfortably. Any significant withdrawals for essential needs, genuine medical emergencies, educational pursuits for any future children must be submitted for approval to the trustee. And for the foreseeable future, Carlos, that trustee will be me." This was my way of saving my son, not just from Zoe, but from his own fatally trusting nature. By placing his inheritance in a fortified trust, I was ensuring that no manipulative woman could ever again use him as a key to the family vault. I was cutting off the supply line that fed his weakness. "I understand completely, Frankie," Carlos said, his voice imbued with a new level of respect. "The paperwork is drafted. All it needs is your signature. I can have it couriered to you this afternoon." He paused, then added, his voice softening slightly, "You are handling this with remarkable strength. Robert would be proud." The mention of my husband sent a pang through my heart, but it was a pang of strength, not sorrow. I was doing exactly what he would have wanted me to do, protecting the legacy we had built together. "I'm not trying to destroy my son, Carlos," I said, my voice softening for the first time, a flicker of the mother beneath the strategist, the pain of the situation finally breaking through my icy resolve. "I'm trying to save him, from her and from himself." "I know, Frankie," Carlos replied gently, understanding the deep, complex love that was driving this difficult, necessary war. "That's what makes this the right move, not a vengeful one." As we finalized the last details, my other phone, a small, anonymous burner phone I'd bought specifically for this operation, vibrated on the polished surface of the desk beside me. A text message lit up the screen. It was from Arthur. My heart gave a single, hard thump against my ribs. "They're inside. The show is starting." The lights of the Neiman Marcus were as bright as a stage, and Zoe walked in, as confident as a star. She swept through the grand glass-doored entrance on Friday, the 18th of October, flanked by her two friends, Jessica and Lauren, a triumphant trio on a mission of glorious consumption. The air inside was a cool, climate-controlled symphony of expensive leather, freshly cut flowers from the floral department, and 100 competing perfumes. Across the polished expanse of the ground floor, half hidden by a vibrant display of Hermes scarves, Arthur found a discreet vantage point near a marble column, his phone angled perfectly to capture the unfolding drama without drawing attention. He looked like any other patient husband waiting for his wife, an anonymous observer in a sea of affluence. Zoe, oblivious, led her entourage directly to the handbag section, a glittering gallery of impeccable craftsmanship and aspirational price tags. Her eyes, sharp and predatory, scanned the displays before landing on a sleek, black Fendi baguette bag, the one she had been coveting for weeks, the same one she described to Jessica in breathless detail. "This is it," she declared, lifting it from its pedestal with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. She slung it over her shoulder, admiring her reflection in a nearby mirror, turning this way and that. Perfect. Jessica and Lauren cooed in admiration, their faces reflecting a mixture of envy and vicarious pleasure. From there, they moved with the practiced efficiency of seasoned shoppers. A pair of Christian Louboutin pumps with their iconic lacquered red soles were added to the growing pile, followed by a bottle of Tom Ford perfume that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. As they moved through the pristine, brightly lit departments, their laughter grew louder, more careless, echoing slightly in the vast space. At one point, Lauren held up a simple, elegant cashmere sweater in a soft shade of cream. "This is something Frankie would wear," she snickered, her tone dripping with condescension. Zoe rolled her eyes dramatically, a grand gesture for her audience of two. "Please, don't even mention my mother-in-law's country club chic. The woman thinks beige is a bold color choice." They all erupted in laughter, the sound echoing with a cruel, dismissive edge that made Arthur's jaw tighten behind his phone. "Don't you worry," Zoe said, waving a dismissive hand, a queen bestowing her largesse. "This is just the beginning. Once we get the full inheritance, we'll be doing this every week." Finally, their arms laden with glossy boxes and crisp shopping bags, they made their way to the main checkout counter. Their haul was impressive. The Fendi bag, the Louboutin shoes, the perfume, designer sunglasses for Lauren, a silk blouse for Jessica, and a half-dozen other assorted luxuries. The young cashier, impeccably dressed in the store's black uniform and professionally cheerful, began scanning the items with practiced speed. The total on the register climbed with alarming velocity: 500, 1,000, 4,000. The final number glowed on the screen, a monument to their morning's work: $9,247.63. Zoe didn't even blink. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the grand finale of her performance. With a theatrical flourish, she reached into her purse and pulled out the crisp, cream-colored envelope. She slid the check out, smoothed it on the cool marble countertop with a sense of ceremony, and pushed it toward the cashier with the tip of a perfectly manicured, blood-red fingernail. "Ring this up, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with the casual arrogance of the effortlessly wealthy, a voice meant to be overheard. The cashier took the check, her professional smile unwavering, a mask of polite efficiency, and began to run it through the electronic scanner. The store, with its quiet hum of commerce, seemed to hold its breath. The check scanner emitted a dry, flat electronic beep, a sound utterly devoid of finality, and a line of stark red text flashed across the small screen. The cashier's professional smile faltered, freezing on her lips as if the digital error had sent a jolt of ice through her. "Just a moment," she murmured, her voice losing a fraction of its cheerful, practiced lilt. She took the check, her movements now a little less fluid, and wiped its magnetic strip with a soft cloth, as if clearing away some invisible smudge. She carefully fed it through the machine again. The same flat beep, the same red error message: transaction denied. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, finally looking up, her carefully neutral expression unable to hide a flicker of professional suspicion. "There seems to be an issue with this check." Zoe's triumphant smirk curdled into a scowl of pure annoyance. "An issue? What kind of issue?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to make a nearby shopper browsing a display of wallets turn and stare. "Is your machine broken? Just run it again, manually." The cashier shook her head, a hint of steel entering her polite tone. "I've tried twice, ma'am. The system is rejecting it." "Well, that's impossible," Zoe declared, her voice rising in volume and indignation, a performance for her friends and the growing audience of onlookers. "That check is for $10,000. It's perfectly good. My mother-in-law, Frances Miller, just gave it to me this morning for a family emergency." The name-dropping and the specific amount were meant to intimidate, to suggest a level of wealth and importance that should override any petty technical glitch. But the young cashier held her ground. "I'll need to call my manager, ma'am." The manager, a polished man in a tailored suit named Mr. Harrison, arrived moments later, his expression one of polite, professional concern. He listened patiently, first to the cashier's quiet, factual explanation, and then to Zoe's much louder, more indignant version of events. "I understand your frustration, ma'am," he said, his voice a smooth, calming baritone designed to de-escalate. "If you'll just give me a moment, I'll call the issuing bank directly to resolve this." He moved to a discreet phone at the end of the counter, his back to Zoe but his profile visible to the growing number of curious shoppers. Jessica and Lauren exchanged nervous glances, their earlier excitement rapidly evaporating. From his post by the column, Arthur slowly raised his phone, ensuring the lens captured the entire tableau. Zoe tapping her foot impatiently, her arms crossed, the manager speaking quietly and seriously into the receiver, and the cashier standing by with a pained, apologetic expression. The call seemed to take an eternity. Mr. Harrison nodded several times, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he hung up and walked back toward Zoe, his professional calm now overlaid with an unmistakable and very public gravity. He did not look directly at her. Instead, he addressed the space in front of him, his voice clear and resonant, carrying easily through the now hushed department store. "Ma'am," he began, the word stripped of its earlier deference, now a cold, formal address. "I regret to inform you that this check cannot be honored." He paused, letting the statement land with the force of a physical blow. "The bank has informed us that the account holder placed a stop payment on all checks from this book last week." His eyes finally met hers, cold and unflinching. "Furthermore," he continued, his voice hardening, "the account itself is currently frozen and inaccessible." "Frozen? Stop payment?" Zoe stammered, the color draining from her face, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking like a grotesque, cracking mask on a pale canvas. That's not possible." She looked wildly around as if searching for an escape, but she was trapped in the spotlight of public humiliation. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Phones were now openly raised, their small red recording lights winking like a dozen malevolent eyes. Mr. Harrison gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to a uniformed security guard who had materialized silently at the end of the counter. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the manager said, his voice now cold as steel. "But for a transaction of this value, with these specific flags from the bank, our policy requires us to involve the authorities." Zoe's two friends backed away, their faces a mixture of horror and a morbid fascination they couldn't quite conceal. Jessica, ever the social survivor, gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug, a gesture of social surrender, before melting into the thickening crowd of shoppers, disappearing like a ghost. Lauren didn't even bother with a glance. She simply turned, her face a mask of mortification, and walked swiftly toward the exit, her own abandoned purchases left on the counter like casualties of a battle she had no intention of fighting. In the space of 30 seconds, Zoe was utterly alone, left to face the nightmare she had meticulously crafted for someone else. The scorn she had so easily directed at me, the casual cruelty she had dispensed over the phone, was now being reflected back at her, magnified 100-fold from the curious, judgmental eyes of the strangers surrounding her. Their whispers were a low, venomous hum, and the glowing screens of their phones were a jury recording her public execution for posterity. 2 police officers, a man and a woman, arrived with a calm, professional purpose that was a stark, terrifying contrast to Zoe's rising, hysterical panic. "Ma'am," the male officer, whose name tag read Riley, began, his voice devoid of emotion, a flat, procedural tone. "We're here to investigate a report of potential check fraud. Can you explain the situation?" Zoe immediately launched into her next and final performance, the role of the wrongly accused, tragically misunderstood victim. Tears, this time perhaps real ones born of fear, welled in her eyes. "Officer, thank God you're here. It's a terrible misunderstanding," she cried, her voice trembling with a desperate, unconvincing sincerity. "My mother-in-law, she's elderly, confused. She gave me this check this morning for my mother's medical bills. She must have forgotten she froze the account. Please, you have to believe me." The lies tumbled out, a messy, desperate cascade, lacking the polish and precision of her earlier performance. These men were not my son. They were not susceptible to tears. They were trained to see through performances. "So, your mother-in-law is Frances Miller?" Officer Riley asked, looking at the check in his gloved hand. "Yes," Zoe sobbed, dabbing at her eyes. "And your husband is Mark Miller?" "Yes, please, you can call him. He'll clear all of this up. He knows everything." It was a fatal miscalculation, a desperate grasp for the one person she had always been able to control. The second officer, a stern-faced woman, made the call. 15 minutes later, Mark burst into the store, his face pale with shock and confusion. He stopped dead when he saw the scene, the pile of luxury goods on the counter, the stern-faced store manager, the impassive security guard, and his wife, his beautiful, confident Zoe, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers. The public shame was a physical blow. I could almost see him stagger under its weight, his world tilting on its axis. The scene shifted from the bright, artificial lights of the department store to the sterile, fluorescent-lit walls of a downtown police precinct interrogation room. Zoe sat on an uncomfortable plastic chair, the bravado completely stripped away, leaving only a raw, terrified woman in a designer dress she could not afford. Mark sat beside her, a study in misery, staring at his hands as if they held the answers to a question he was too afraid to ask. Officer Riley sat opposite them, a thin file on the metal table between them. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice still maddeningly calm. "The bank confirms the account was frozen on Tuesday, the 14th of October, at your mother-in-law's request. That was 2 days before she allegedly wrote you this check for a family emergency." Her story of a sick mother and a confused elderly benefactor began to crumble under the weight of simple, verifiable facts. The timeline was a mathematical certainty she could not argue her way out of. The final act of Zoe's collapse came when Officer Riley turned his unwavering attention to my son. "Mr. Miller," he asked, his gaze sharp and unwavering, "were you aware of this $10,000 debt for your mother-in-law's surgery?" Mark's head shot up, his eyes wide with the panicked look of a cornered animal. The truth and the lie were at war on his face. He looked at his wife, whose own eyes were now begging him to lie, then at the officer, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. Finally, he managed to stammer, his voice a choked whisper that was a confession in itself. I thought so." His phone vibrated on the metal table, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent, tense room. The screen lit up, displaying a single glowing word, "Mom." He stared at it, his hand frozen in mid-air, knowing with absolute soul-crushing certainty that the real reckoning had only just begun. Mark came to my house that night, not as a son returning home, but as a criminal returning to the scene of the crime. He stood on my doorstep on the evening of Thursday, the 17th of October, slumped and hollowed out, the arrogant confidence he had displayed on the phone completely gone, replaced by a profound, gut-wrenching shame that seemed to weigh down his entire body. I let him in without a word. The heavy silence of my meticulously clean living room, a far more potent accuser than any angry outburst from me could ever be. He sank onto the sofa, the very spot where Zoe had performed her masterpiece of grief just 2 days prior, and buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he finally choked out, his voice muffled by his palms. "It was Zoe. She twists everything. She manipulates. I didn't know the whole story. I really thought her mom was sick. I never would have." He trailed off, his apology a pathetic, reflexive attempt to shift the blame, to cast himself as another of her victims rather than her willing accomplice. I let him talk, listening to the flimsy excuses pile up, each one a testament to the powerful, toxic hold she had on him and his own lack of a moral spine. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply waited. When his stream of self-pitying justifications finally ran dry, I walked over to the side table, picked up my tablet, and placed it on the coffee table in front of him. I pressed play. Arthur's video filled the screen. The giddy, triumphant shopping spree, the mocking laughter about my country club chic, Zoe's arrogant strut to the checkout counter. He watched, his face a mask of disbelief and a deepening horror. But it was the crystal-clear audio of her phone call from the car that finally broke him. When he heard her sharp, cruel voice say, "The gullible old bat actually bought it," I saw something in him shatter, a final, painful disillusionment. I stopped the video. "Zoe is a con artist, Mark," I said, my voice cold and even, stripped of all maternal softness. "But you were her accomplice. You pressured me. You used my love for you as a tool for her greed. You chose her side against your own mother." The truth of the words hung between us, stark, brutal, and undeniable. He stared at the black, reflective screen of the tablet, speechless. The final pieces of his carefully constructed delusion had been shattered, leaving only the ugly, unforgiving reality. "That is why I have made some changes," I continued, my tone leaving no room for negotiation or appeal. "I met with Carlos today. Your inheritance, the money your father and I worked our entire lives for, is being placed into an irrevocable trust." His head snapped up at that, his eyes wide with a fresh wave of panic, the reality of his consequences finally dawning. "You will never be destitute, Mark. The trust will provide for your essential needs. But you will never again be in a position to allow a woman like that to plunder this family's legacy. I am protecting you, and I am protecting what your father and I built." The last of his composure crumbled. He broke down, not with the theatrical sobs of his wife, but with the raw, ragged weeping of a man who has finally understood that he has lost everything, most of all, his own self-respect. "Mom!" he cried, looking up at me, his face a mess of tears and regret. "What do I do now?" I looked at my son, my heart aching with a love that was now tempered by a hard-won, painful wisdom. "That," I said, my voice devoid of warmth, but not entirely of pity, "is something you will have to figure out for yourself. You are a grown man, Mark. It is long past time you started acting like one." He left shortly after, a ghost of the man who had walked in, his shoulders bowed under the weight of his actions. The sound of the front door clicking shut was a sound of finality, of a line drawn in the sand. I stood in the quiet of my living room, the air suddenly feeling lighter, cleaner, as if a long, festering wound had finally been lanced. For the first time in months, I felt like this house was truly mine again, a space unviolated by lies. But as I looked out into the dark, quiet street, I knew the battle wasn't over yet. 6 months later, on a warm April afternoon in the year 2026, I sat on my porch, sipping a glass of iced tea, the condensation cool against my palm. The birds were chirping a frantic, joyful song in my newly planted garden, their notes a cheerful counterpoint to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. For the first time in a very long time, I felt a sense of peace that was not tainted by any underlying anxiety or unspoken doubt. The quiet tranquility of my home, once a lonely space filled with the ghosts of unspoken tensions, was now a hard-won sanctuary, a fortress I had successfully defended. That peace, I had learned, was the most valuable asset I owned, more precious than any stock or bond. The mail arrived with the familiar thud against the inside of the mail slot. Among the bills and catalogs was a thick, cream-colored envelope from Carlos's law firm. I opened it with steady hands, my heart calm. The formal legal language within confirmed what I already knew. The divorce between Mark Miller and Zoe Miller was finalized. Due to the clear and overwhelming evidence of fraud and malicious intent, bolstered by the video Arthur had taken and the police report from Neiman Marcus, Zoe's claims on marital assets had been summarily dismissed. The judge had not been kind. She walked away with nothing but the mountain of credit card debt she had accumulated in her own name. There was no sense of triumph in reading the words, only a quiet, somber finality. A painful chapter had definitively closed. A few days later, while browsing the local news on my tablet, a small headline in the crime section caught my eye. Local woman receives suspended sentence in check fraud case. The article was brief, detailing Zoe's plea bargain in the Neiman Marcus incident. She had been given probation and ordered to attend counseling for compulsive behavior. Her life, as the merciless online comments section pointed out, was in ruins. Her reputation was destroyed, her circle of friends had abandoned her, and she was facing a future defined by debt and public disgrace. The price of her greed had been her entire world. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. Through the security camera I'd had installed, a small concession to the new world I now inhabited, I saw Mark standing on the porch. He was thinner, the boyish softness in his face replaced by sharper, harder lines, but his eyes were clear. He had been through a fire and been forged, not broken. I opened the door. He didn't try to hug me or offer any grand, emotional speech. He just stood there for a long moment, a box of pastries from my favorite bakery in his hands, his gaze direct and filled with a sorrow that was finally genuine. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "and thank you." I looked at my son, the man he was becoming, and gave a slow, single nod. It was enough. "Would you like to come in for some tea?" I asked, stepping aside. It wasn't forgiveness, not the easy, unconditional kind I had given him his whole life. It was something more valuable. It was a beginning. It was an invitation to build something new, a relationship based not on obligation or deceit, but on the hard, solid ground of earned respect. As I watched him step across the threshold, a man finally learning to stand on his own 2 feet, I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. Perhaps sometimes the only way to truly save a family is to be willing to break it first, and from the shattered pieces, something truer and stronger can finally be built. As I sipped my coffee in the quiet of my home this morning, I realized the silence no longer felt like loneliness, but like a hard-won peace. I learned the hardest lesson of my life. Setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty, but the ultimate act of self-respect. True family doesn't come with a price tag, and my love is not for sale. This newfound tranquility is a gift I gave myself. I'm curious to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to draw a difficult line in the sand to reclaim your own peace?